Howdy folks, Shell Presto here. Today we're going to talk about underpaintings while I do a realistic portrait of my fictional character Labyrinth from my and my husband's Ascension Epoch books. So what is an underpainting? An underpainting is exactly what it sounds like. It is the first layer of painting you do, and then you paint over it. It's almost like using layers in something like Photoshop or Manga Studio, a digital program, except when you put your layer 2 on top of it, if you screw up, you can't delete one or two of the layers. So it's a traditional method of working in layers. Usually underpaintings are applied in oil or even sometimes acrylic, but I wanted to go out on a limb and try it with watercolor because I've been using watercolor lately. And I heard that Alex Ross uses underpaintings when he does his paintings in gouache, and gouache is like watercolor, so I thought, hey, I'll give it a shot. Before I get into more on underpaintings, let me say that I am using Canson Mixed Media paper for this painting, which I don't actually recommend if you want to do an in-depth watercolor piece. I mean, it worked. I didn't experience any art-ending problems with it, but I did do a lot of wet and wet with this, and that made the paper buckle a lot, which is to be expected. It wasn't the paper's fault. But this is just a practice that I've been doing. I haven't tried a realistic painting in a long time. But when you approach a watercolor painting, you really should be using at least 140-pound paper. The thickness will stand up to wet and wet a lot better. Now for the pencil sketch, I'm using Master's Touch Fine Art Studio watercolor pencils. These are the Hobby Lobby brand of pencils. They're very vibrant until you add water. I don't think they're particularly light fast, and I don't actually recommend them for doing watercolor paintings with alone. The reason being is that the color before you add water is very clear and vibrant, and the instant you add water, it dissolves like crazy and you can barely see the color. This is bad if you want to do a finished painting with these things, but this is excellent, completely excellent if you want to use them to do your pencil sketch that you're going to paint over with much better paints, which is what I did here. I really love these Hobby Lobby Master's Touch pencils for doing my sketches because they dissolve like nothing else, and it's wonderful to not have to worry about having the lines there. Also remember, when you are penciling before a painting, refine. If something looks wrong with the sketch or it doesn't look exactly how you like it, the shapes will not get any better when you go to paint them. Now watercolors you can fix here and there, but try to get the general sketch looking how you want the face to look. There are two reasons to use underpaintings. One of them is to add color variety. Some people don't do a full-blown underpainting but will go in and add some shading and highlights with different colors than they're going to glaze over them. When underpainting, you will always be lightly glazing on your, we'll say, overpainting. So you can lay a base down. For example, maybe in the shadows of your painting you want purples or blues, but you don't want to actually go in on the painting at the end and in the shadows add purples and blues. You can underpaint in your shadows in those hues, and I don't know, maybe you want a warm orange light as your lighting, or a pink light. You can put light washes of pink where you want your highlights to be, and set that down, and then when you do your skin wash over it, you have those color tones underneath. That is not why I'm underpainting in here. I'm using the second reason. The second reason, and the reason why I'm using an underpainting today, is that removing color from your thought process can really simplify the painting process and allow you to focus on form and getting things to look correct. The shapes of things, the shape of the cheekbones, the contrast between the chin and the neck underneath the jawbone. Contrast really affects the final look of your painting, and it's something that I've always had difficulty with working in color. For example, cheeks usually have a bit of a reddish hue to them, but when I look at the reddish hue of a cheek versus the lighter, peachier tone of a forehead, we're obviously talking light skin tones here. I can tend to get confused about what my lightest color is because there's red mixed partially in parts of the face, and that throws off my perception of color. Or I should say perception of tone, of what is the lighter color and what is the darker color, because a ruddy, rosy color is going to look darker than a peach, but when you actually look at just how bright or dark it is it really brighter or darker or not? So a monochromatic, that's one color, underpainting can really just let you focus on getting the shapes and the tones and the contrast and the brightness and the darkness correct, and really refine your shapes before you even think of adding color. Now, you can absolutely do an underpainting in black. I don't know that I'd recommend it, but you can do it. And as a matter of fact, Alex Ross does his underpaintings in black, so he might know better than I do. But regardless, whatever color you choose to do your underpainting in, you want it to be a color that can reach very dark darks, and it's going to affect the tone of your piece. I chose a sort of tawny yellowish brown. I did this because, well, we write science fiction fantasy books, and Labyrinth is a wizard. So when you're dealing with wizards, what they can do is obviously spectacular and otherworldly, but his pursuit of it can make him seem like a boring character to other people. He's very studious, and to reflect that, I like giving him, and all my characters, a color palette that reflects their personality. Since he, personality-wise, can be, sort of down to earth and boring, I like giving him an earthy, sort of washed out tone to him. Kind of like sepia tones in the beginning of The Wizard of Oz. So he's a not very exciting man who can do very exciting things. Now when you do an underpainting with watercolors, especially when you're going to do a very detailed underpainting with watercolors, you have to take into consideration the fact that watercolors lift, and different brands of watercolor lift in different strengths, we'll say. You don't want to do an underpainting that when you go on with your second layer of paint and you have your, say, I don't know, we're going to make this sweater red. So we have a brown underpainting and we're going to put a red sweater on it. And we don't want, when you've got your second layer and you've got your red and your water on your paintbrush and you're about to, and you apply it to your brown underpainting, you don't want the brown to lift up and the pigments to push away. So Obviously, you don't want to use a watercolor that can easily lift for your underpainting, or else it's just going to pick right up or smear or slide around when you add your overpainting. My favorite brand of watercolor to use right now is Prima Marketing's Watercolor Confections paints. I really like these because a lot of the colors lift well and you can move them around fairly well, and I like being able to go back in with my watercolors. But that means I do not want to use these paints for my underpainting. My other favorite brand of watercolor I like for entirely different reasons. I also use Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus liquid watercolors. These are very intense. I mean, the watercolor confections by Prima also get pretty intense colors, but the P.H. Martin Hydrus are really intense. I bought them. They're really as intense as inks, but they're much more light fast. And I bought them to make up for the lack of intensity, especially when I'm doing pieces with watercolor pencils, because it's hard to get intensity with them. But the Dr. P.H. Martins do not lift well. They will move around on the paper quite well while they're still wet with their first application, but usually when they dry, they're there. They'll re-wet in your palette. You can use them again that way, but yeah, they're very permanent once they dry. That makes them a good candidate for underpainting. Now, I wanted them to be able to move around a little more than they usually can, so what I ended up doing when I mixed my colors for this underpainting is I used, we'll say, between 1/2 and 2/3 of the paint mixture was made from the Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus watercolors, and the other 1/2 to 1/3 was I mixed in some of the Prima watercolor confections. This gave me something that for the most part would stay where I put it once it dried, but it still had a little bit more ability to move. And they mixed very well. Some paints don't mix together well, or they don't stay together, or some, like the one paint will float to the top. But that didn't happen for this. This mixture worked out quite well for me and worked exactly the way I wanted. So to get my underpainting, I mixed Dr. P.H. Martin's Hydrus watercolor colors in Venetian Brown and Gamboge. Let's hope I pronounced that right. You know how I am with French words. And I used the Prima Watercolor Confections Cavern color from its Woodland set. And those colors combined gave me what I am using for the underpainting. Now, this was a very interesting experiment for me because this person doesn't exist. Labyrinth, his real name is Paul Wendling, if I end up saying Paul at some point. I made him up. I don't know a single person that looks like him. So what I ended up doing was trying to look at references of different people I could find who have features like his. I might look at one picture of someone for the cheekbones and a different picture of someone for the chin, and changing the shapes as I go and just trying to eyeball it off people with similar features to try to get a final piece that looks like a real person who doesn't exist. This isn't necessarily a big challenge if you're going to be doing just line work, but once you get into form, when you do this, you have to very carefully consider your light sources. Every photograph you're going to be looking at is taken in a different setting, at a different time of day, at a different angle, with different light sources. So when you go in to add form, keep in mind your light source that you want for the painting and make sure you apply it to every shape on the page. After you get your face rendered the way you want it, with careful attention to the how dark you want the darks to be and how light you want the lights to be, and careful consideration for, I always find the bridge of the nose and right underneath the eye sockets, like from where the eyebrow comes down to the bridge of the nose, and right beneath the eyes. Very, I won't say difficult to do, but very intense to do. I find that can really make or break the realism on your painting, so I recommend you look there especially and take your time. And don't be afraid to make your shadows a little darker underneath the jawbone, the shadows on the neck, just to make the face pop forward a little bit more. Also, take into account the opaqueness of the watercolors that you will be using to add your various colors on your overpainting. If your watercolors that you're going to be using for your overpainting are very opaque, you know, gouache is its own thing. Gouache is very opaque, but other watercolors have a range of opaqueness to them. They can be very transparent, which means you can see through them very easily, or they can be kind of opaque, which means they cover up more of what you put over them. A lot of the Prima watercolor confections they have they're not super transparent, we'll say that. They're not super transparent. I knew that they would be covering up the colors underneath them more than a very transparent watercolor, so I wasn't afraid to go dark in my underpainting because I knew that that would get lighter when I put lighter colors over it. If you're using very transparent, be careful with how dark you go on your underpainting because that darkness will show right through. Alright, so you've got your underpainting complete, you've got your darks as dark as you want them to be, you've got your lights as light as you want them to be, and you've got your forms rendered. Next you're going to start glazing your actual colors to give the piece many hues. Glazing refers to a thin coat of paint. How do you get watercolors thinner? You add water. If you're not sure how dark it's going to end up or how dark you want it to end up, or you're, you know, not 100% comfortable with your paints, you'll want to go in with more water at first so that the layers are lighter. You can always build up color with watercolors. It is hard to take colors away, especially depending on which brand of paint you use and how well they lift up. Like I said, I like to use Prima watercolor confections because they lift up pretty well and most of the colors are pretty light fast. Prima makes some pretty interesting palettes. This is not sponsored, by the way. I just really like these paints. Prima makes some pretty cool palettes. They're usually under themed colors. They usually work really well if you just use the colors in a single palette, but for this piece I had a clear concept of what I wanted this character to look like. So I do not limit myself to a single palette. I have 3 sets. The sets I have are called Decadent Pies, Tropicals, and Woodlands. And the colors, while single palette colors are meant to all work well together and gel really well together, obviously colors from other sets can gel really well with colors from other sets. For the hair, I use coconut and pineapple from the tropical set. The tropical set tends to be very bright, but I also had a dark muddy underpainting underneath this, so I knew that I could add a brighter color and still not have it come out as blindingly bright. Coconut is kind of a toned down color too, so that cut through the brightness of pineapple. And that's another thing. You need to take into account what color you have put underneath your, what underpainting color you used, because it's going to affect the colors you put over top of it. If you have, like this, a darker brown underpainting, then your colors are going to turn out a little muddier. You might want to saturate them up a notch for it. If you use, say, cooler tones, you do a purple or a blue in your underpainting, or a green, because that complements, say, skin tones and warmer, ruddy tones well. And, you know, really bring some darkness into those shadows. If you don't want it to appear green or purple or blue, you may have to mix your paints a little oversaturated when you're going over those colors with your glaze. Or apply more layers to get the effect you want. When I do the skin tones, I use a combination of peach cobbler and banana cream. And then I use, when I go in at the end and make things redder and warmer, I use redwood and foxberry. I use foxberry last because it's a very, very, we'll say, reddish or pinkish tone, and I find especially on men's faces you can very quickly overdo it with the reds and pinks, but if you don't have any in there, it kind of looks a little lifeless. I also use foxberry for the sweater, and I use a mixture of banana cream and coconut for the shirt. The eyes get a little complex. Most people, even if they don't have brightly colored eyes, tend to have a mix of at least two colors in their eyes. And you can really, I don't know, when you're painting eyes, you can really overwhelm it with colors, and you can really underwhelm it. So my best advice for doing eyes is to take a little bit of risk, and if it doesn't work out, lift. Of course, that only works if you're working with watercolors that lift well. I put a little bit of that bright pineapple in the center of the eyes to give them extra light and lift and brightness, and then I go over them with a mixture of, well, different layers of, I don't mix them and put them in, Cavern and Redwood from the Woodland set. And at that point you're just trying to tone down the brightness, but that initial brightness can be very important. Labyrinth here has like dull brown eyes. I essentially want him to, we'll say, have the feel and excitement of a very old leather-bound book. This character studies ley lines and their connection with doorways and the innate magic that surrounds entrances and exits. So he can make the front door to his house, which is either, I haven't decided yet, it's going to be Wisconsin or Vermont. But he can make the front door to his house, instead of opening up to his, you know, porch and driveway and front yard, open to his work office in New Jersey. And if he feels like it, he could change it to make that front door open to his parents' beach house. Obviously, if you're in a fight with supernatural creatures, this has many applications passively in a fight too. But, you know, there's a spark in a life that you want to capture in well, for me, with this character, that you want to capture in his eyes. Obviously, if you're doing a painting of your loved one at home or whatever, you have special feelings for them. You want to give them, you know, a light and a life in their eyes. So if I'm doing brown eyes, I will often do a bright yellow as the center, and then add the brown around the rim and go in just to get that balance. If I'm doing green eyes, you could add a, traditionally I might add bright yellow or like a spring green, a light green, a chartreuse, and then go darker around that. Blues, even if the eye overall is a muted blue, you can add a bright light like a sky blue or a little more muted sky blue as your interior color. Hazel eyes, again, a bright yellow. And gray eyes, you probably still want to do a pop of blue on the inside. You know, brown, blue, green, hazel. Violet eyes are exceptionally rare. If you want to go very exotic with a violet eye and out there, you can add a magenta underneath it. Otherwise, you might want to do a blue. But glazing is very straightforward. It's kind of like trying to put color on top of an old black and white photograph. And you don't need to, like, the stress is gone if you do this underpainting. You don't need to worry too much about rendering anything. It's almost like coloring a coloring book. You just want light, flat washes of color over it. One thing to keep in mind is your highlights. I actually went too heavy-handed with the color on the hair here. I lost, usually your hair picks up a little bit of white or glint from the light around you, so I lost some lighter tones that should have been in there. But like I said, I haven't used this method of painting in a long time. This is just getting me back into it, and I think overall it turned out really well. But, you know, ideally I would have gone a little lighter to start. And then you could put darker layers where the shadows are. Obviously, I was using an opaque paint. I had to go in with some dark brown. I mainly used Bear mixed with Cavern from the Woodland set. A lot more Bear, that's a very dark brown color, just to go back in on, we'll say, the shaded side of the nose, the darkest part of the cheekbones, the interior of the ear, and a lot underneath the jawbone on the neck. A lot of the shadows on the neck and on the sweater I had to just go over again with that dark brown color to reintroduce the darkness, because the lighter opaque paint took some of that out. I didn't go in and darken any part of the hair because, especially with men's hair, when men have short hair, and also with women, but women tend to not get it buzzed quite so close. But when you have very short hair, you actually get some of the coloration from the scalp coming through, and you don't get very, very dark shadows on the hair. So I didn't reintroduce any brown into the hair. I thought that looked good enough. Now, I could have gone in with white gouache, which is very opaque. There's two different kinds of gouache. There's acrylic gouache and there's watercolor gouache. Obviously, the watercolor gouache behaves more like watercolors and has various lift, and the gouache that I own has very good lifting properties. I do have a video where you can see me doing a landscape behind a character. I paint a subway at night with my gouache paints on this channel. But anyway, I don't use any gouache here. But if I wanted to reintroduce those whites and those lighter colors, I could have very easily got out my white gouache, mixed it with a a tiny bit of one of the watercolor colors that I was using. For example, I could have used that pineapple coconut mixture, mixed it with a little bit of white gouache, gone in and reintroduced highlights into the hair with that much lighter color. But this is an exercise painting for me. I really love the look of it. I'm going to use it for professional purposes. You know, it'll probably appear in books and on websites and stuff like that. But it's just an exercise. It's just for me. I'm not selling it to anyone. It's not going to be hung up on a wall in a gallery or anything like that. So for ease's sake, I'm just going to go in on Photoshop and I'm going to add some lighter tones to the hair, a couple lines here and there. I'll add white highlights in the eyes and, you know, little things like that. But if you screwed up too, or you feel like your glazes or even in your underpainting didn't leave enough light tones, just mix some white gouache with the colors that you were using and you can reintroduce it white that way. So finally, the only other thing of note with the actual traditional painting portion of this is adding some red tones to the male face. I personally always get scared doing this because you can go overboard quickly and suddenly the guy looks like he's wearing makeup, which we don't want. But the problem is that without any red tones, the skin looks pretty lifeless. So it's one of those you really have to do it things. Some areas of the human face are a little more translucent than others, or have more blood vessels close to the surface. You can see a little more red in the cheeks, on the ears, a bit around the eyes. You can also usually see purple or blue below the eyes. I added a tiny bit of gray called Greystone from the Woodlands paint set below the eyes here. I didn't want to add a saturated purple or blue tone because I wanted to keep this painting feeling warm overall. Anyway, so we're not going to get into the blues very much, but as far as the reds go, when I go in and add my rosy tones to the nose and the cheekbones on a man, I keep it very low. Tip of the nose, bottom of the cheekbones. When women apply blush, apply it to themselves, makeup, they tend to put it high on their cheekbones, right below the eyes. But that's not actually where faces get red, unless we're talking about sunburn or blushing from embarrassment. Usually, it doesn't start at the corners of the jaw, but it stays in the area between the bottom of the cheekbone and the corners of the jaw when a natural redness. Much lower than we're accustomed to thinking in our heads. Of course, when I paint women, I put the red tones higher, even if the woman isn't wearing makeup, because it looks pretty on women, and that's sort of what we expect to see from movies and magazines and the like. So besides the cheeks and the nose, redden up the top of the ears and a little bit around the eyes, and you're good to go. There will be a link to a second video covering the highlights and adjustments that I did on Photoshop to finish this piece, but here it is without highlights. I'd just like to remind you fine folks that Labyrinth will appear in the sequels to our Challenger Confidential novella, Copper Knights and Granite Men, written by my husband and I. Each chapter of the book has an illustration by yours truly, and buying a copy from Amazon or other online booksellers helps the channel. A pretentious superpowered musician, an ageless techno-wizard, and a radioactive commando walk into a museum and find the patrons turned to stone. Copper Knights and Granite Men is a witty and suspenseful superhero adventure that draws from the King in Yellow mythos and taps the secret occult history of North America. Please give this video a like if it was helpful, and please subscribe to catch my future videos. Also, if you have any questions or advice about underpaintings that you'd like to share, please leave a comment below. Likewise, I'm always happy to field questions about art in general, and may even make your question or suggestion a future video topic. Most of all, though, thanks for watching my video, and I hope you have an awesome day. Presto, over and out. So that was a painting of modern-day Labyrinth. Copper Knights and Granite Men could be categorized as weird fiction or urban fiction. But lately I've been drawing Labyrinth in a medieval setting for a comic strip in Bexham's Bazaar magazine. This is how I usually draw on a day-to-day basis. Very comic bookish, very fun. But as an artist, it's good to branch out and have aspirations. I don't think realism and painting is any better or worse than comic art and ink. They both have their place and time. But I thought you fine folks would like to see a purely 2D rendition of who I tried to paint more realistically today. Keep on drawing, and have an awesome day, folks. Presto, over and out.